I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to the RANE Insights podcast from RANE Network. In this episode, founder of RANE, David Lawrence, sits down with Dr. Mark Gold for part 5 of their discussion on the United States of addiction, dealing with the opioid crisis in the medical community and beyond. Dr. Mark Gold is an author, inventor, mentor, and world-renowned expert on addiction-related diseases. Dr. Gold has had over 1,000 peer-reviewed publications since beginning his academic career at the University of Florida College of Medicine and Yale University School of Medicine in the 1970s. Dr. Gold has modernized addiction in psychiatric training, fellowship, and treatment programs while hopeful that research would translate into new, more effective treatments. Check out Dr. Mark Gold's full bio and host of written publications at psychologytoday.com. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Mark, thank you again for joining us for what I think will be a very important and timely discussion. And again, congratulations on your article, which we'll post alongside this podcast. You have written a terrific and very, very timely article. Which drug epidemic is next? Meth, psychedelics, mushrooms, etc. And I couldn't help, both based on the article but also our prior discussions, recite a little bit of a spiritual message from the book of Ecclesiastes about there's nothing new under the sun, it's all been said and done before. I was thinking about that as I was reading your article. So in any event, let me turn the floor over to you, and this will be, I think, a very, very interesting conversation for our audience.
Well, I appreciate it, David, and it's a very interesting time because we have a lot of attention being paid to the opioid use epidemic and a lot of attention being paid in changes in death rates. So, just to go back, we started all this with prescription opioids, and then we morphed once there were restrictions on prescriptions and pill mills. We morphed into heroin epidemic, and that quickly was overtaken by a fentanyl epidemic. And then the last phase has been kind of a dual shift where we shifted towards smoking and speedballing, combination of opioids and a psychostimulant. Well, historically, the opioid epidemics of the past, the early 20th century opioid epidemic, as well as the opioid epidemic in the 70s, were followed quickly by speedballing and then by a psychostimulant epidemic. And I in the article in Psychology Today, I got the chance to think about some of my teachers. So, the holidays are a time when you do reflect back, and I had the great opportunity at Yale to learn from David Musto, who wrote a classic textbook called The American Disease, which was about how drug epidemics come and go and have plagued the United States. And there are very few times where there's no drug whatsoever being used other than in Prohibition, and still there was considerable use. And I also learned from Musto about cocaine and the cocaine epidemic, and we got a lot of time to spend talking about cocaine and cocaine's effects. And he was mostly interested in history and maybe the overall zeitgeist of the time. And so he would make the point that after opioids, people are sluggish and they're sleeping and they're disconnected, and that cocaine tended to have the opposite effect, energizing and ambitious and doing things. And really, it was his thinking about this that got me to be able to work with Bob Bick at Yale also, who was a pharmacologist, translated Sigmund Freud's cocaine papers. And thanks to these guys, I became interested in and somewhat of an expert on cocaine and cocaine effects on the brain. Suffice to say that opioids act principally by their effect on opioid receptors and systems, endorphins, and cause sleep, euphoria, and so forth. Cocaine has a different effect, which is part of my research history, was showing that cocaine had an effect on the end process in the pleasure system, so that it was possible to have opioid effects and cocaine effects that added together, and so you remove the negative cocaine effects with opioids and you get the parallel systems for high, the dopamine system with cocaine and the opioid system with opioids, and that's really where speedballing comes in. The novelty right now is, rather than injecting it, as would have been the case during the Saturday Night Live times, it's smoked and mixed. And another novelty of our time is, rather than cocaine always being paired with heroin, as it was in the 70s, fentanyl has replaced heroin, and in many cases methamphetamine has replaced cocaine. And in a American disease sense, capitalism drives many of the drug changes, and here you eliminate the farmer and the middlemen, and all you have is a bunch of chemists in the lab making fentanyl and shipping it, or making methamphetamine and shipping it, and it can be easily used. So we have right now deaths due to speedballing, deaths due to methamphetamine, deaths due to cocaine. And it just seemed to me that while everyone was talking about the tremendous progress being made in opioid overdose deaths, all of which is true, the switch process is upon us, and we're switching from the all-out opioid epidemic to speedballing, and ultimately to what I say in this paper is cocaine epidemic.
So Mark, one of the questions I have, because you've been doing this for so long, is what explains the trends in usage and addiction? And I still remember, it was a number of years ago, as you know, the opioid crisis had not by any means crested, but you were already telling me to expect stimulants to be the next wave.
Well, I mean, there's only a certain amount of sleep and dreaming and euphoria that people can take. There's a drive for discovery and a drive for innovation, and we've had a really long opioid crisis, and so it had to end sometime. Some people said it would end just because we've killed so many people, like way over 500,000 people have died in a short period of time, but they had been replaced by younger people. So one change you might note, and this was in the Wall Street Journal this week, and I was really gratified to see it because it also proves this thesis, is that they were talking about people on Wall Street wanting, needing, and using Vyvanse and also Adderall to be able to work longer hours and to remain motivated and concentrate for long periods of time. So this new burst of energy and work activity is stimulant related. You can't imagine that being opioid related, because opioids have the opposite effect. So I do think there'll be a pool of stimulant users who could be prescription stimulant users, prescription stimulant seekers, people with full-time active jobs, people who want more aggression, more alertness, more awake time, and also will convert the number of people who are using opioid drugs to speedballing, and then many of them will convert over, because in animal experiments, if animals have equal access to and unlimited equal access to opioids or psychostimulants, over time they'll switch over. And they switch over because psychostimulants stimulate their own taking. Opioids stimulate their own taking, but in opioid use, you do nod off. Where in stimulant use, you'll go on a binge and you could work for 20 hours and not sleep. That's not possible with opioid use.
Now, are you suggesting that this coming wave, or the wave that we're actually in now, is predicated upon people searching, for more efficient, more effective ways to do their jobs, to get ahead? Or is this, again, just experimentation and the sort of the natural order that people are prone to, I'll call it experiment with things that stimulate or reward the brain?
Yeah, well, there is that, and you're right about that. But I do think we may be entering a period of robust work activity, changes in expectation around work. You might have to go to work. It might actually be in person. It might be hard. You might be expected to compete. And all of those would drive psychostimulant use. You have alertness being valued, aggression being valued, intensity being valued, being there on the job a long enough period of time. And now, of course, there's burnout and everything like this, and that's a separate podcast here with you. But in the acute phase, we're leaving this pandemic and everything that's associated with it, and we're moving in a new direction right now. And you see that on Wall Street with psychostimulants, and you see that in the street with chronic drug users who also are trying to make a change in their life. I think, we heard a little bit about this when there was a shortage of psychostimulants. You might remember, and there was a question about psychostimulant supply, and then there was the question about how many people who are adults actually have an adult attention deficit disorder. Why are so many adults taking psychostimulants? And they were crowding out the use, and it was unavailable for child psychiatrists and adolescent psychiatrists to prescribe for young people with ADHD. But I do think you see that, and it coincided with a time of increased work productivity, and we'll see what happens here. The other thing that is happening, and you mentioned this in the intro, is this psychedelic use. And if you look inside the data, most of the data shows decreases in teen use of alcohol, decreases in teen use of tobacco, decreases in teen use of cannabis, but at the same time increases in use of psychedelics like LSD, DMT, like ayahuasca, like psilocybin, and even ketamine. So the question is, should we be worried about that too? And so in this same Psychology Today piece, I introduced this. I don't go into the greatest detail, but it clearly the Silicon Valley and the Silicon Valley both vibe and culture has been built in large part on the Burning Man and the psychedelic quote vacations, retreats, and music festivals, which were very important in Silicon Valley in the past, and probably, well, to a lesser extent, still today. But that ends up being, in part, like a celebrity endorsement. So they're celebrities to all of us, whether it's Elon Musk or whether it's Steve Jobs. And we understand that psychedelics tend to not be taken every day. There are microdosing, but they tend to be taken to produce hallucinations and an altered state where there might be some insights and some psychological change with a guide. But you do need an extended period of time, hours, for this to happen. And sometimes there are like staycations where you go to a therapist's office and it feels like a therapeutic vacation. So it's not really the same as thinking about psychostimulants, which are used chronically in binges and to excess, and where the use stimulates its own use. For psychedelics, it's the opposite. If you actually use a typical therapeutic dose, there's tolerance, and there isn't self-administration with animals. We don't have overdoses. We have some poisonings, but they're rare. And we have a small number of people relative to the psychostimulant available people out there. So I'd say the psychedelics are interesting, and they're really interesting from your point of view, David, like people always searching. Like I'm working on what I think are the best articles, scientific articles in 2024, and one of them is actually an article that tries to understand what psychedelics do, other than cause hallucinations, and in particular, what ketamine does. And this might be relevant to the Silicon Valley culture, but in one of these papers that I'll summarize in the new year when I finish it, they showed that the main effect of ketamine is to stop you from giving up. Like, you work and work and work, and you're frustrated, and you want to give up. And there is a point in time where you say, I've had it, I give up. And there's an animal model for that. Believe it or not, it's in a zebrafish. But so in this animal model, when the animals get to the point of giving up and swimming against the current and just dying, they give them ketamine, and they become immune to giving up.
So, Mark, you've touched upon a number of things, and I want to go back because I know a lot of your work has focused on this. What I'm hearing is, people are not just taking the stimulants, to potentially perform better, perform longer, etc. But there are, in the workplace, competitive pressures to keep up, particularly, and to get ahead in organizations. And that was certainly one of the points of the Wall Street Journal article that you referenced. But there's also what's going on in academia, in high schools and colleges, and what students are taking in order to be competitive, to keep up, to get ahead, to get into certain schools. And I'm wondering if you have some perspective here on what I'll refer to as the burgeoning use and maybe one can even call it, a crisis among younger people, and where this activity is actually starting at the school level.
Yeah. Well, so like for psychedelics, this is a point of great concern because while there are the Silicon Valley and other celebrities who, in essence, are the commercials for use. If you think of as I said, Steve Jobs or Sam Altman or Sergey Brin, the kind of, mega tech stars, and they've all discussed the Silicon Valley's relationship to psychedelics and their own. And you have Mike Tyson and Aaron Rodgers and other sports celebrities doing about the same thing. So younger people have been increasing their use of LSD, ayahuasca, MDMA, mushrooms like psilocybin, and it's not a coincidence. The celebrity endorsements are real and important, and the risks of use for teens and young adults are much, much different. So just like the risks of cannabis are psychosis, the risks for psychedelics are psychosis, flashbacks, depression, alienation, loss of interest in daily activities, and a whole host of other changes. Their brains are not formed, so to reboot them really, or to change them before they are formed is highly risky, and no one's suggesting that. I think that's out there as a risk, and in the same for college age, we have people emulating these stars, and I know I saw Elon Musk on CNN at one time, and he tried to make the distinction that his use of ketamine was prescribed, which to me meant that it was the Johnson & Johnson Spravato, which is prescribed and approved for use as a nasal spray for recurrent or treatment-resistant depression, which would be quite appropriate, and there's a high degree of safety and efficacy for that product. I mean, I think that's a subtlety that's often missed by most people, and that is that there are medical uses for drugs, and those medical uses are important, can be life-saving. Everybody knows that morphine is used for pain, and morphine is the most closely related to heroin of any drug. So,
Yeah, but what you've been highlighting in your article is not the medically prescribed.
right,
It is the experimentation. It is the attempt people for, greater performance, whether it's in the workplace, in academia, etc. And that means that people are getting access to various drugs, including Adderall or types of stimulants,
yep,
and that this is increasing in use.
right,
And so if we're focused on this, I really, I reread your article several times. There were several things that just kept coming back to me, which is, what is the responsibility that our government has, that the deans and presidents of universities have, that employers have? And it can't be willful blindness, okay? It can't be people know what's illegal, they know what they shouldn't be doing, we have a code of conduct, and then just sort of walking away. Because this is going on, and as you've chronicled throughout your career, this is what people do. They do it for recreation, they do it for reasons of self-treatment, of anxiety and depression. They do it, for purposes of enhancing their performance. And so, Mark, as you're looking out here, what exactly is the collective responsibility around this?
Well, I mean, you have your career as a U.S. attorney, and you'll remember we didn't know anything in the United States about cocaine. It was on the cover of Time magazine as the champagne of drugs. No one could get it. It wasn't even available. I remember myself asking about it for research. It was impossible to get. We learned about cocaine and cocaine effects mostly by watching people on Saturday Night Live. We learned about speedballing from them because that's how John Belushi died at 33. We learned about speedballing from Chris Farley. That's how he died at 33. We learned that cocaine could make you paranoid and delusional because Phil Hartman's wife killed him thinking that he was an imposter. And we learned about people who would check themselves in to Betty Ford for addiction to a drug, cocaine, that organized psychiatry in the 70s and 80s said wasn't addicting. That's cocaine. So we like the role of celebrities, and there's no commercials for these drugs and drug use, but there are celebrity endorsements, and waiting around for someone to die so you have a negative endorsement, it just doesn't seem to work. I mean, I would reframe the Saturday Night Live thing and say, well, gee, why don't people focus on Robert Downey Jr.? Because he had all these problems and entered treatment and relapsed, and maybe he had cocaine and heroin and alcohol, and now if you talk to him, he'll talk about how being sober is the best thing in his life, and how getting treatment changed his life and career, and how his newfound success is due to that. Or you might remember Chevy Chase or Garrett Morris.
Sure.
Or there's a whole group of people at that time who had these terrible cocaine-related problems that they got help and got better. Right now, we have different kinds of role models and different kinds of celebrities. So I made the case that some of the Silicon Valley people are clearly celebrities. And then we have sports stars. They're clearly celebrities. And they're driving at least the psychedelic drug use trend. The trend for psychostimulants seems to me to be based on an odd fact, which is that you really do not need a diagnosis to have some performance-enhancing effect from psychostimulants. And there's a series of papers by NIDA researcher Jean-Luc Cadet, which basically says, independent of any diagnosis, if you are given psychostimulants, you'll sleep less, concentrate better, and should have commensurate performance enhancement. So they've looked at psychostimulants, oral methylphenidate, Adderall, as performance enhancing. So if you were to say the straight students might have a disadvantage in head-to-head competition at times.
So what I'm, just my takeaway here is that there are many reasons out there and role models out there that sort of would encourage at least experimentation in these areas, and that may be attributed, causing the rise in usage in this next wave. The part of your sentence that I was waiting for you to complete, Mark, was about their benefits to people who may not have underlying prescribable conditions, and therefore those people are taking that. But where are they getting it from? And
I think some of them, and we'd probably have to go to a poll people who are currently taking them. That was kind of missing from the Wall Street Journal article, was the diagnosis is exclusively history and checklist. So if you're someone who's looking for prescription psychostimulants, you might find on the internet or elsewhere descriptions of what people are like, how they felt, how they think, and pass the criteria for the DSM for it. It's not like for substance use disorders where you have to have a drug present, or it's not like driving under the influence where you have to have alcohol or drugs present. In this case, you just need to be able to answer the questions, and then you'll be prescribed psychostimulants.
so is this a situation where I can't, I'm going to go back to Ecclesiastes now, Mark, because I still remember the prescription marijuana. I don't want to go into the debate about this, but Venice Beach, basically for $5, you could see a doctor and tell him you've had headaches and this and that. He'd write out a prescription, right? And there was a series of checklist questions.
Like that.
I mean, and similarly when dealing with pain medications and what happened with the opioids, there, people would go to certain doctors and, describe their maladies, and there was a bit of a checklist there as well. Is that where we are? I mean, is this, just sort of call it 3.0, 4.0, whatever it is, in terms of the addiction crisis? Is that what we're about to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are pretty easy criteria to make. That doesn't minimize them, and it doesn't mean that a person who meets the criteria and is prescribed and takes the medication as prescribed, they'll have benefits. And I'm not against or for. I'm just saying there's testing, and people know that they have testing in children and different testing in adolescents and testing in adults, and those assessments used to be done in children by board-certified child psychiatrists, in adolescents, and in adults by psychiatrists. But nowadays, you have all sorts of generalists, primary care, all sorts of providers who do this assessment, come up with a DSM diagnosis, and the treatment generally includes psychostimulants rather than even therapy. And I think there are online providers for this as well, so you wouldn't have to leave your house to be able to get it, as you said, kind of like in the old, like some of the other prescriptions, maybe for erectile dysfunction medicines. There's not going to be confirmatory testing that's prescribed. There's not a blood test. There's not an EEG. There's not. It's a questionnaire the DSM has criteria which you have to have 5 or 6 of them, and let me give you some idea of them. Like, they often fail to give close attention to details, makes careless mistakes, has trouble holding attention on tasks, often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly, has trouble organizing tasks. The DSM diagnoses is about work-related failures, and the prescription is psychostimulants. So again, back to Musto, in an era that would value energy, enthusiasm, hard work, work above everything else, it's all in favor of psychostimulants versus opioids. How about this? Often fidgets or taps their hand and feet. It all sounds like everyone.
It sounds like everyone. It also, I was with my 2 young grandchildren. It sounds like them, and 2 very active boys. And what I'm just getting a sense of here is, as part of this next wave, that there is, a built-in mechanisms, institution, enablement, facilitation for the use of these things. And yet no one, that I'm aware of, I haven't seen the warnings as I did from some people about the opioid crisis that was coming. But if this is how things are marketed and this is how things are prescribed and diagnosed, et cetera, and understanding that I might not want to take these things, but if I'm going to keep my job, if I'm going to get ahead, if I'm going to do well in school, I got to do it. I have no choice. The playing field is not level. This may be the wrong analogy, Mark, but I could, bring this home to the issues of why certain athletes engage in sports doping.
Right. Well, it is an athletic performance. We're talking about performance enhancement. It would be good to directly ask people at the workplace, like in that Wall Street Journal article, who are taking psychostimulants, if they felt that kind of pressure to perform and felt that they were disadvantaged by not taking psychostimulants. Those would be very important. But I do remember there was an early study of either Apple or Google or one of those Silicon Valley firms, and the culture also provided for on-site prescribers for psychostimulants. And it may be that rather than the speedball, we'll have psychostimulants to exhaustion and then need psychedelics to recharge. We'll see. But yeah, I do think these business celebrities and the new advertisements, endorsements are changing things, as well as the opioid use disorder crisis has been, so long-standing, and we're just over that now that COVID's over and we're back to work.
Okay. I may, after this podcast, have to re-listen to my vinyl of the Jefferson Airplane. Go Tell Alice.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. Let me, just in the 2 minutes or so that we have left, I think we'd be remiss if I didn't have you share with the audience what some of the downside risks are concerning the use of psychostimulants?
Sure. I mean, the first, of course, is that compulsive use, you lose control. And with loss of control comes dependence. With dependence, you actually tire out or burn out your brain's dopamine system, and you're physically and mentally exhausted. You're so depressed from that that you feel like you were run over by a steamroller and you can't move at all. So psychostimulants are often used to exhaustion, to cardiovascular collapse, heart attack, stroke, suspiciousness, paranoia, and it's not just Phil Hartman's wife. It's that they just produce eerie kind of false beliefs for cocaine or amphetamines can produce hallucinations, delusions, and all that. It makes it very, very difficult. On the other hand, when you're talking about some child with ADD or ADHD and they're prescribed psychostimulants, interestingly enough, if they take them as prescribed, we're not talking about cutting them up and sniffing them or loading up. If they take them as prescribed, the child's risk of developing a substance use disorder is actually decreased. So the untreated ADD, ADHD is a risk for substance use disorder, but treated, it is a protective factor.
Okay. And can I add the adverb responsibly prescribed?
Yes. Yes, I mean, where there's a clear indication, where it's not just about getting extra time to take an SAT or other test. It's a complicated area, and there's a lot of this going on. This is kind of really good that you got me to think about this, because I hadn't really been directly thinking about it. There may be such a thing as cosmetic psychiatry, where some of these medications that we have now would have effects on everyone regardless of their diagnosis. And you see this in endocrinology with GLP-1s. You don't need obesity to lose weight on GLP-1s. Basically the new obesity medicines, anybody can take those and lose weight. Where we don't have an adequate supply, and we've tried to reduce that, but you do have the cosmetic effect. For SSRIs like Prozac and Zoloft, they weren't prescribed primarily for people with severe depression, not at all. They're used for people who have anxiety, social anxiety, shyness, mild depression. Once you got into the realm of severe depression, that's where the more significant psychiatric treatments came in. For SSRIs, they were prescribed to lots of people that didn't meet criteria for major depressive disorder, and could also be considered cosmetic in the sense that everyone who would take them, or most everyone, would feel less shy and more self-assured. So it's a new age, and we're starting to see this as we shift out of the opioid crisis.
Yeah. And I want to remind people, because Mark's been at the heart of this, and you alluded to it today, Mark. Look, this is a very complex and multifaceted problem, not the least of which it's a geopolitical problem.
Yes.
When you look at the sources of the raw materials, the supplies, the technology, no less the importation of finished product and things like that. And I was reading with interest. I had not focused on this before, Mark, but with every regime change, invariably things get exposed. And the brutality of the Assad regime was known, but now in great detail. But the thing that I was not fully aware of by any means is the extent to which his family was involved in drug production and the exportation and the significant profits that were earned from this, involving a drug called Captagon.
Oh, yeah, Captagon.
Which he was essentially the principal manufacturer and supplier throughout the Middle East, and it's used for recreational purposes and other things in troops. But what I didn't also appreciate was that this was a drug that was actually developed in the 60s in Germany to treat ADD, just to bring it home to the points that you've been making and some of the points of your article. So from a geopolitical perspective, this is also, your article is also very, very relevant.
Thanks. I mean, it's important, I think, to think through the whole idea that chemists are replacing farmers, and simple mail, like U.S. mail or other mail services are able to replace transshipment. You saw the article about fentanyl chemists being recruited for labs in Mexico, so that they didn't have to wait for Chinese or Middle Eastern manufacturing. It's a Huxley Brave New World.
You think about this as a business and business efficiencies and shortening supply chains and onshoring production, right? That's
Yeah,
basic.
and you brought the Captagon thing up, and we know in animal experiments that regardless of what your drug preference is, if you start using stimulants, you'll then use both and eventually usually switch to stimulants alone.
And certainly a takeaway of the message here beyond, I see this, hopefully, Mark, people will read the article, and our policymakers and clinicians will begin, I know, but hopefully
Yeah, I mean,
we'll focus on this.
I think that these interviews make me feel like we're making some progress. I think it's important for people to see trends so we can plan accordingly.
Right.
And I do think, just like you asked me specifically about downsides of things, that people say, well, ayahuasca helped Aaron Rodgers, and there's a TV special on right now about this. That's incomplete information and could be confusing as an endorsement. Yeah, no, I really do appreciate your support in getting the word out about these. It's one thing to write about once a week, but if no one reads and comments and we don't influence policy or the knowledge base, I won't be making much in the way of progress. So I think I thank you for helping me this year and getting the word out. I got 50 of these articles up on the Psychology Today website, and I hear from people who are in education that they use them in colleges, and people in treatment that they use them to train counselors, and I've heard from people at the DEA that even some of them have been shared with colleagues at DEA and NIDA and NIH and NIMH. So I'm grateful to everyone who in 2024 has sent one or more of these things around.
Okay, well, I'll make a note here as well that since you were referencing Steve Jobs, I think part of what I particularly value is not only the depth of your experience in this space. You're not a poser, you're not a newbie to this issue. It's the thoughtfulness, but the simplicity and conciseness of the articles is, I think, a very, very valuable public service, Mark. No one has to wade through either a wonky policy speech or some, medical or academic journal.
That's funny. Yeah. It's really been my experience too that I start out and I might write I've written 1,000 scientific papers. So I start out, I probably have 5,000 words, and the editor there says, "This is really great, get it to 1,000." And most of them are around 1,000 to 1,200 words. As a result, she's really been very, very helpful in getting me to be as pithy and relevant as possible.
Okay. Well, more to come, and I do want to follow up not only on this article. I'll note for our audience, Mark has spoken about the current issues around legalization of marijuana. National Geographic actually has a piece this month. Maybe I don't know if it's in the print edition or I just saw it online, on understanding the downside effects of marijuana. So, Mark, you were ahead of it, but hopefully people are paying attention. In any event, I look forward to getting together with you right after the new year, Mark.
A happy New Year to everybody.
Okay. Have a safe one, and again, thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the RANE Insights podcast from RANE Network. Be sure to check out Dr. Mark Gold's full bio and host of written publications at psychologytoday.com. Want more RANE content? Find the RANE podcast series wherever you get your podcasts, or visit our website at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.